King crabs are expanding into near-freezing oceans, where their heavy shells, slow metabolism, and high energy costs should make survival impossible. They persist not by thriving, but by operating constantly at the edge of physiological failure, where even small environmental changes are enough to keep their bodies functioning. Cold ecosystems, once protected simply because such predators could not exist there, are now exposed without having evolved defenses. The unsettling truth is that nature does not require safety margins, only conditions that are not quite lethal. At temperatures where nerve signals slow and muscle chemistry hesitates, sustained movement should quietly stop, and the body carrying that movement should stall with it. The expected outcome is delay, then failure, then stillness. But the motion continues, measured and unbroken, as if the limit were never crossed at all. Only after that contradiction settles does the subject appear. King crabs, wrapped in a shell that evolved for warmer, shallower seas, now walking across environments that were once defined by biological absence. This is not speed, not aggression, not some sudden mutation that breaks the rules outright. It is persistence at a temperature where persistence should be expensive, inefficient, and eventually lethal. Cold water reduces metabolic rates, slows enzymatic reactions, stretches the time between impulses and nerves, and makes every contraction cost more relative to the energy available. Most large-bodied predators are filtered out here not by violence but by arithmetic. Energy in versus energy out stops balancing. The equation collapses. And yet these crabs keep moving. Their bodies are not redesigned for the cold in any dramatic way. There is no antifreeze miracle, no exotic chemistry. Instead, the horror comes from something quieter. The margin of safety shrinks, but never quite reaches zero. Limbs still lift, joints still articulate. A heavy mineral shell still gets carried forward step by step, even though calcification itself becomes harder as temperatures drop and carbonate chemistry shifts. Every meter walked costs more than it should. Every meal repays less than it used to, and still the system does not shut down. In deep, cold ecosystems like parts of the Southern Ocean, many native animals evolved without hard-shelled predators at all. Not because they were weak, but because building and carrying armor in that cold was historically too costly to sustain. King crabs are an exception that did not belong to this design logic, and for millions of years, they stayed out. Now warming waters relax the thermal constraint just enough. Not enough to make life easy, just enough to make it possible. That narrow window is what feels wrong. The crabs are not thriving in comfort. They are operating close to their physiological edge, running a body plan with almost no buffer. Growth slows, molting becomes riskier, energy budgets tighten, but the basic function remains intact. From the outside, the movement looks calm. From the inside, it is a constant negotiation with physics and chemistry that never cared whether the outcome was stable. This is what makes the expansion unsettling. It is not an invasion driven by excess. It is an advance powered by systems that should, statistically, collapse more often than they succeed, yet don't. The cold was supposed to be a wall. Instead, it has become a thin membrane, and through it walks a creature whose body was never meant to pass. Not because nature made a mistake, but because nature allows survival right up to the point where it finally doesn't. A structure that requires constant mineral input, repeated rebuilding, and precise timing should become a liability when resources thin and temperatures fall. Protective mass should be the first thing abandoned when survival margins narrow, because protection that cannot be maintained turns into dead weight. Yet the shell remains. King crabs carry an external skeleton built from calcium carbonate, layered, rigid, and metabolically expensive, in an environment where carbonate availability drops and cold water slows every reaction needed to keep that armor intact. The paradox is not that the shell exists, but that it keeps being repaired. Molting is not optional. Growth requires the old shell to be shed, the body to swell with water, and a new shell to harden before vulnerability becomes fatal. In cold conditions, this process stretches longer than it should. Soft tissue remains exposed for extended periods. Energy drains while nothing visibly moves. By all conservative calculations, this is the phase where failure should concentrate. And yet, molting still happens often enough. The cost is enormous. A significant portion of the crab's energy budget goes not into movement, reproduction, or repair of internal tissues, but into rebuilding a mineral casing that the cold actively resists forming. Unlike warm water relatives, these crabs cannot rely on rapid shell hardening or abundant dissolved carbonate. The chemistry is slower. The margins are tighter. Each molt becomes a gamble placed against physics rather than predators. The unsettling part is that the gamble keeps paying out, not because the odds are good, but because they are just barely not catastrophic. The shell offers clear advantages once complete. It provides leverage for muscle attachment, resistance against predators, and structural support for a large body size that would otherwise be unsustainable. But those advantages arrive only after the most dangerous phase has passed. During the process, the crab carries a paradoxical burden, a future benefit that actively increases present risk. Most biological systems avoid this. Evolution tends to favor solutions that reduce peak vulnerability, not ones that concentrate it. Here, vulnerability is accepted as a recurring cost of existence. In cold ecosystems, many animals avoid this trap entirely by never building rigid external armor. King crabs do the opposite. They commit fully, every cycle, to a structure that the environment makes harder to afford. The result is a life strategy that runs with no safety margin during critical windows, trusting that timing, temperature, and chance will align often enough. There is no drama in this process, no sudden collapse, just a repeated decision to rebuild something that almost costs too much again and again until the arithmetic eventually fails. The horror is not that the shell protects them, it's that the shell keeps being possible at all. Low temperatures are supposed to enforce stillness. Chemical reactions slow, muscle contraction weakens, and the time between usable energy pulses stretches. In cold-adapted animals, this usually results in reduced activity, long pauses, and strict conservation. Movement becomes rare and deliberate because it has to be. King crabs break this expectation without breaking the rules. Their metabolism does slow in cold water, exactly as physics dictates, but their behavior does not collapse into inactivity. They continue to walk, forage, and expand their range, not quickly, not efficiently, but consistently. This is where the contradiction deepens. A slow metabolic rate should cap sustained movement. Energy intake arrives too slowly to support continuous locomotion, especially in a heavy-bodied animal carrying a mineral shell. And yet the crabs keep advancing across the seafloor, step by step, over distances that accumulate into ecological change. The explanation is not hidden speed, but endurance built on low power output over long time scales. Each movement is cheap in isolation, but there are many of them, and they never truly stop. The system avoids collapse by staying just below the threshold where fatigue would accumulate faster than recovery. This strategy is fragile. Any increase in cost, a colder patch, less food, a failed molt, would push the balance into deficit. There is no buffer, only continuous adjustment. Native cold water species evolved under different assumptions. Many are slow-growing, soft-bodied, and largely sessile, relying on chemical defenses or low visibility rather than movement. They expect predators to be rare, sluggish, or absent. A large, armored animal that can keep moving at low metabolic rates violates that expectation, not because it is fast, but because it is persistent. The crab does not need to outrun anything. It only needs to keep walking longer than the system was designed to tolerate. Over time, this turns metabolic restraint into a weapon. Each step is insignificant. Thousands of steps are not. Energy efficiency here does not mean abundance. It means the ability to operate indefinitely at the edge of insufficiency without tipping over. From a distance, this looks uneventful. No chase, no burst of activity, no obvious strain. Internally, it is a constant negotiation between intake and expenditure, a balance that never resolves into comfort. The unsettling realization is that collapse is not prevented by strength or speed, but by slowness so controlled that it becomes unstoppable. In an environment where most systems pause to survive, a body that never quite pauses begins to rewrite what dominance looks like. A predator entering a new system usually meets friction. Prey flee, hide, harden, or adapt in small, incremental ways bought by evolutionary memory. Here, that memory is missing. In parts of the cold Southern Ocean, many native species evolved for tens of millions of years without large, shell-crushing predators. not because such predators were defeated, but because they never arrived. The cold itself filtered them out. As a result, the defensive logic of the ecosystem simplified. Spines became delicate, shells thinned or disappeared entirely, behaviors slowed. Energy was allocated toward growth, reproduction, and chemical deterrence, not toward resisting heavy mechanical force. When king crabs move into this system, they are not especially aggressive. They do not need to be. Their claws apply pressures that local prey were never selected to withstand. The paradox is not predation, but asymmetry. The crabs are operating well within their functional limits, while the prey are pushed instantly beyond theirs. There is no arms race yet, only a mismatch. Sea stars, urchins, mollusks, and slow-moving invertebrates do not recognize the threat as something that requires immediate response. Some do not flee at all, others cannot. The result is not chaos, but quiet efficiency. Consumption proceeds without resistance strong enough to alter behavior on either side. From a systems perspective, this is where instability begins. Predators usually regulate themselves through effort, chasing prey, risking injury, expending energy. Here, the cost of feeding is low relative to the impact on the prey population. That imbalance accelerates depletion without triggering the usual biological breaks. The unsettling aspect is how ordinary it looks. No dramatic collapse, no visible struggle. Just a steady reduction in organisms that once structured the seafloor, filtered water, recycled nutrients, and maintained spatial complexity. The predator does not overperform. The system underdefends. This is what makes the invasion feel inevitable rather than violent. Evolution did not fail the prey. It simply never prepared them for a force that, until recently, could not physically exist here. The horror lies in realizing that safety was never a property of the organisms themselves, only of the temperature that kept their predators away. Rapid invasions are usually loud in the data. Population spikes, explosive reproduction, dramatic swings that announce instability. This one is quieter. King crabs do not flood cold ecosystems by multiplying faster than everything else. Their reproductive rates are unremarkable. Their growth is slow. Their juvenile survival is constrained by the same cold that limits everyone. By classical models, this should keep expansion in check. Instead, range boundaries continue to move. The paradox is that nothing is pushing back hard enough to matter. Competition is minimal because few native species occupy the same functional role. There are predators, but not ones adapted to handle a large, armored crustacean. There are scavengers, but they arrive after the work is done. The crab does not outcompete by being better. It persists by being unmatched. In systems with high biodiversity and overlapping niches, new arrivals are forced into trade-offs. Gains in one area mean losses in another. Here, the trade-offs barely exist. The energy extracted from prey is not immediately balanced by increased predation or disease pressure. The space opened by consumption is not rapidly refilled by functionally equivalent organisms. Instead, the system thins. Expansion proceeds not as a surge, but as a slow diffusion, stepwise, almost hesitant, yet never reversing. This is what makes it hard to stop. There is no single lever to pull, no obvious excess to correct. The crabs are not breaking carrying capacity in the short term. They are redefining it over long time scales. Each individual impact is small enough to look tolerable. Collectively, they accumulate into a structural shift. Cold ecosystems are built on stability and low turnover. Energy moves slowly. Recovery assumes disturbances are rare. A continuous low-level pressure is worse than a sudden shock because it never triggers emergency responses. The unsettling realization is that the invasion does not need momentum. It only needs time. In a place where ecological change was once paced in geological units, even modest biological persistence becomes overwhelming. The system does not crash. It erodes. And erosion, by definition, is hardest to notice while it is happening. Cold once functioned as an absolute constraint. Below certain temperatures, body plans simply stopped working, not gradually, but decisively. Muscle efficiency dropped past usefulness. Development slowed beyond viability. Mineral structures became too costly to rebuild. The map of life had hard edges, drawn not by geography, but by thermodynamics. What is unsettling now is not that those rules were wrong, but that they were conditional. As ocean temperatures rise by small, uneven increments, the cold does not disappear, it loosens. The barrier becomes a gradient, and gradients can be crossed. King crabs do not suddenly flourish in warmth. They enter zones that are still cold, still energetically hostile, but no longer prohibitive. The paradox is that nothing about their biology fundamentally changes, yet the outcome does. The same shell, the same metabolic constraints, the same slow movement now operate on the other side of a line that used to be uncrossable. This exposes an uncomfortable truth about biological limits. They are rarely margins of comfort. They are margins of failure. Life persists right up to the point where systems stop closing, reactions stop completing, structures stop forming. When the environment shifts just enough to keep those processes barely functional, organisms do not need to improve. They only need to continue. Cold ecosystems were never protected by strength or resilience. They were protected by exclusion. Remove that exclusion, even slightly, and the protection dissolves. The crab's advance into regions like Antarctica is not dramatic because it does not violate physics. It obeys it precisely. Warmer water holds more usable energy, alters carbonate chemistry, and reduces the metabolic penalties that once made large, armored predators unviable. None of this guarantees success. It only removes certainty of failure. And in biology, that is often enough. The most disturbing implication is not about crabs at all. It is about the idea of refuge. Many ecosystems exist as they do because something else cannot reach them. When temperature ceases to be a reliable gatekeeper, isolation becomes temporary. The system does not adapt in anticipation. It reacts after thresholds are crossed. By then, the change is already normal. The crabs are not anomalies, they are indicators. They demonstrate that survival does not require favorable conditions, only conditions that are not quite lethal. As those conditions expand, so does the map of who can exist where. The cold was never a moral boundary, never a promise of safety. It was a physical filter, and filters work only while they remain intact. When they thin, life passes through, not with intent, not with malice, but because nothing in the rules ever said it couldn't.